Hello and welcome to the 26th Annual Get Lit Festival. I'm Kate Peterson, Director of Get Lit Programs, a nonprofit organization housed within Eastern Washington University in Spokane. Our program is responsible for Get Lit, Washington State's longest-running annual literary festival, which hosts free and low-cost readings, writing workshops, craft classes, panel discussions, and more, featuring many talented writers from our region and beyond. The festival is taking place this Thursday through Sunday, April 11th through the 14th, in many venues across Spokane and Cheney. And we're very happy to be back with you in this virtual space as well. You can find a full schedule of in-person and virtual events, along with information about all of our festival authors by visiting our website, getlitfestival.org. Now I'd like to introduce Get Lit's Assistant Coordinator, Liz Graves, who will tell us about today's event.
Hello, everyone. I would like to welcome you to the Sacred and the Profane, a reading and discussion on womanhood, motherhood, and grief with Sarah Gazhal Ali and Cori A. Winrock. From navigating what it means to be a woman to motherhood and the vastness of time and space, Sarah and Cori center questions of erasure and silencing, while also exploring how we tell stories in the midst of violence and grief. Sarah is a Pakistani American author whose work includes international themes, and her debut collection, THEOPHANIES, explores the spectacles of gender, faith, and family. Cori's genre-bending writing is infused with memoir-esque narratives and historical artifacts. She identifies as a queer writer. Now I'll hand it back over to Kate, who will get us started with our first reader.
Thanks so much, Liz. So our first reader is Sarah Gazhal Ali. Sarah is the author of Theophanes, selected as the editor's choice for the Alice James Award. A Janekian scholar, Stadler Fellow, and winner of the 2022 Sewanee Review Poetry Prize, her poems and essays appear in Poetry, American Poetry Review, the Yale Review, and elsewhere. She is the poetry editor for West Branch and lives in the Bay Area, California. Please welcome Sarah.
Hello, thank you so much for having me, Kate and Elizabeth. I'm really excited to read and then to hear Cori read and then be in conversation because I think there's so much interesting overlap between our books. So I'll begin by reading a few poems and then we'll take it from there. This is the book, Theophanes. It just came out. And I think a lot about, as we kind of talked about in the theme for our reading and talk today, motherhood and daughterhood and grief and womanhood, and specifically the women that I think of as the matriarchs in Abrahamic scripture, and particularly my namesake, Sarah, so the wife of Abraham, as many consider her. So you'll hear that in a lot of the poems. Sarai. A name is not unlike a sexed body. Like mine, it carries, is remembered most for what it fails to yield. A name is a condition meant to last, to outlast, as should a daughter her mother tongue. I am but do not have a daughter. When I look in the lake, who looks back is a sister self. Oh, little I carry you as you carry who I am waiting to be. Self-portrait as Epiphany. I thought myself a child. The river revealed me a basket. Within a doomed girl grew and groomed. When came the bush, I knew to burn, to sheer errant tongues probing the cage. Mother sang of deliverance. Father prayed for a son. I revised myself a daughter, renounced duty, rolled stones down my throat. In a dream, the angel reveals me a book. I learn myself grime among false gods. Unashamed, I cramp. Between my legs, a clot. From a clot, I'll make men. Hollow myself holy. Nothing laughs like me. Brittle, brutish, a woman baring her teeth. This next poem is called Annunciation, but it's not about who you would typically think an Annunciation poem would be about. It's not about Mary, it's about Sarah. Annunciation. My pillaged body is not as interesting as my virginal sister's. I know. Your books efface me, dismiss me as naturally lacking. So my hair has long since grayed, cropped short, held back under a matronly veil. I sent my husband to bed another woman. I'm nobler for it. I allowed a slight to get the ball rolling. By moonlight, I grieved the perpetual blood, marbling red and black down my thighs. They visited me first, God and two angels. They came with glad tidings, announced I would flower with a boy. But all you remember is what came next. I hung my head and laughed. When God at last conferred my body with fruit, the angels raised their yellow wings. They broke bread. I listened until I heard a great humming, a child, a ripe boy I would mother. The hive coming to me after all I'd done, what else inside to offer at the moment of absolution but a flash of sound? I knew I wasn't favored, but damned. My whole long life I'd been groomed to unfurl for the coming of bees. I knew when I passed he would go back to her, and you to your matter day, your lily among thorns. After all this, knowing I'd be written over, a vessel forgettable but for a moment of sonic lapse, tell me, what would you have done? Daughter. Too stubborn to supplicate, I bend for luster, not love. For absolution, I break my bones and soften gristle with what teeth remain. Mine an umbilical affliction without cure. Do you think I ask to eavesdrop through inherited eyes? Recite to me a single memory, not manufactured. Even a mother is myth, fabling to survive a marriage, miscarriage, man. Call me a reed, voices lake behind my eyes. The rims of wounds have wounds as well. I have a theory about mirrors that I won't risk repeating. The women who made me already know. Gazhal on the day of. Like God, I'll create in my image. Go on, past judgment. Like I'm not already waiting for judgment. Like I don't tease, don't taunt to turn his eye my way. Like I'm not expiring, short-sticked by a judgment foretold in unteachable, spiraling math. Each sky's bloated yoke barrels toward the day of judgment. Seated, I take seeds to stifle my soil's waiting green. I liken my name to apology. I wield judgment like a snapped beak and shovel night from my abdomen. Are you watching, O corkscrew calamity, O decree, O closer than jugular? Come for this constellating mess. I'm sorry for laughing, O giver, not for taking, so judge. The ideal. The ideal mother bursts with child without bleeding. Her attenuated wrists bear heavy bangles, coupled and gold, embracing a tasteful watch she doesn't need to check. Her hair a sheathed black, never modeling, even under glare of sun. Her skin pristine, unrippled by sin or prior loss. In a thermal scan, she appears a chilled blue, her depths placid. She doesn't complain in heat or unnatural shafts of light, even when startled by a winged apparition. She is kind to strangers on the bus. She offers gum and sunscreen. In her dreams, visions of the impossible sons, fathers of faiths, a first and singular child of some hearsay divine. When the command comes, the ideal drops her groceries. Without shame, she lifts her dress and leans back on her haunches. She waits for salvation to fall, and it does, colostrum seeping. The opaline hue of it sears her bare hands. So this next poem is one in a series of matrilineage poems, and it's a contrapuntal, which means that it can be read multiple ways, and it looks like this. It's a column on the page, split into two, and so I'll read it three ways, going down the right column, then going down the left column, and then reading it left to right, going across, and I'll just repeat the title each time. Matrilineage umbilicus. The first inheritance, where you detach from an undug grave. In one language named Eve, the period preceding. But origin can't be an oculus. My abdomen rounded. From navel to sex, text appeared, alif, abjad, mammalian. I did not want this. It appeared from figment. Witness. Matrilineage umbilicus. A puncture wound. Your mother. Call it provenance, Havva, or life source. Some say wife or mother of, tethered to consequence, doomed to gape before a mirror. A line appeared, linea nigra, the first letter, aleph inferred, I matriline. Look how I multiplied. I bore your body. Matrilineage umbilicus. The first inheritance, a puncture wound, where you detach from your mother. An undug grave, call it provenance. In one language named Havva, life source. Eve, the period preceding. Some say wife or mother of, but origin can't be tethered to consequence. An oculus doomed to gape before a mirror. My abdomen rounded. A line appeared from navel to sex, linea nigra, text appeared. Aleph, the first letter. Abjad, aleph inferred. Mammalian eye, matriline. I did not want this. Look how it appeared. I multiplied from figment. I bore witness, your body. I will read just one more poem. I'll read one of the title poems, THEOPHANIES. If nothing else, at least this clemency. Two whirls in each face, round pistols burrowed and searching. Tariq asks what I saw in my sleep. I weave a sweet lie about my mother's pomegranates, the kitchen tiles we bloodied, searching for the seed in each, rumored to belong to a mirror tree in paradise. The truth, a girl with melting eyes who holds my gaze all night, vitreous rivers gushing down our faces until one of us wakes. There is no unseeing it. The whites, thick and clotted, erupting into weeds where they fall near my feet. My people don't share what darkness we've seen. Fear a message from the devil. Tariq says true dreams reveal themselves at the first inhale of sunrise. How to hold wide my eyes for the ineluctable light. On a disappeared horizon, a bush continues to burn, a lilied cervix swarms green, and Jacob is still sightless, 40 years lost to grief. Clouds drone above me, my 2 ordinary eyes sealed in sleep. Every vision is redolent and terrible, every temporal sight either a miracle or mistake. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. Our next reader is Cori Winrock. Cori is a poet and multimedia essayist. Her second collection, Little Envelope of Earth Conditions, was awarded Editor's Choice for the Alice James Book Prize. Her book-length essay, Alterations, is forthcoming from Transit Books as part of their Undelivered lecture series. She is the winner of the Boston Review Poetry Prize, and her essay on twins was selected as a notable essay in Best American Essays. Her work has appeared in Poetry, the Best New Poets Anthology, Black Warrior Review, and elsewhere. Cori holds an MFA from Cornell University and a PhD in Literature and Creative Writing from the University of Utah. She is an assistant professor of interactive poetry at Western Washington University. Please welcome Cori.
Thank you so much. Sarah, that's a hard act to follow. Really incredible to have the chance to hear your work out loud after hanging out with your book for the last couple of weeks. I'm going to open on the opening poem of the collection. I'm really excited to read some pieces that I don't usually today. I wanted to really think about work that was in conversation with Sarah's work and this idea of matrilineage. But I think this opening piece really is where this collection came from. I had just moved. I had 2 children under 2. I moved away from my family right after my mother had died. And so I was a new parent without my own matrilineal sort of background with me. And so I felt like I had landed on the moon without any way to kind of manage that. It opens with an epigraph. What you say in a body. You can say nothing outside of this body. What would happen to your body in space without a spacesuit? Whose foreheads should we kiss to check for fever? Whose memories are those we keep so close to our wrists? The stars are only us, before us, afforded by so much distance. We have drawn pictures of such animals we have never seen. We have become such sky-slung animals in our most untender moments. Our bodies have been exposed to all sorts of things. The stars don't believe in weeping us to sleep or singing us in to a new season. In space, we imagine we are holding each other by the hand instead of holding our own hands over our mouths. To grieve, to be grieving. No one is going to come tell us it's not safe to be holding our breath. We learn to sleep with our hands in the dark of strangers' mouths, keep our heads singing in hopes of bringing our lost helmets back. How warm-blooded the moon must still seem when seen from the earth. Landscape in which I am obliterated by light. Innocent sleep, sleep that knits up the raveled sleeve of care. Nothing fits properly in this space, little sleeve. Are you watching the way I'm crawling across the walls of every room of the house like a wet, near-dead thing, like the sad sack that I am? Little sleeve, the dead are everywhere in my poems, and I've forgotten the living body is a necessary antecedent to landscape. Landscape of unfreezing cells, of new ringing forests, landscape of remorseless heat and dry light. Little sleeve, spring is coming, coming and dragging its thaw and snow shedding stink. Little sleeve, The yard is dismantling its panoptic mantling of white, and I want to be sucked into the mud's black hole vacuum instead of mapping our way to another doctor. I swear I once heard someone say, there are only so many images a body can take before the skeleton is stolen in light. Is it a given that every TV emergency ends in joyous resuscitation? Little sleeve, I left my teenage bones to winter as x-rays in a folder in a drawer. There's a run in the quietness of every pair of my stockings. Little sleeve, so many bodies are denied as body, and your body is not even. We are being resurrected from DNA, and the youngest ever brain frozen for a new body to be built for her 500 years into a future. Little sleeve, is this really what we call saving? Across an ocean, drones are banqueting as bees, as bombs and bridal arrangements, and we call this progress. The satellites are monitoring our devolving. Little sleeve, how does love appear in no gravity? Like love, like love. Little sleeve, no one has told me what happens when I reemerge to a thawing earth, what happens when a daughter returns from the underworld to the exact moment, the exact same grove of known trees, but no mother, no child. Little sleeve of her own accord, little ravel, I've dug up the bulb of our girlhood body from the frozen yard as if everything stays perennial, as if aster rather than ash. I've buried our hands in my mouth. Little sleeve, always on the cusp of these two bright emergency rooms, Demeter's gorgeous force on the brink. Come and get me, I'd like to hear myself say, to be contagious, to be uncontained. Little sleeve, you are distilled to a certificate we signed before we could leave the hospital with your sister. Little, sing to me. Little, sleeve me tender. My throat is worn slender as a seam. My heart gone to seed. Little, it's impossible to turn around to tell if what is spilling from us is water or salt or star. Little sleeve, your legs are dragging behind me. I swear nothing will fit in this spacesuit but us. It was after I wrote that end line to that poem that I started to really realize that this book was about not just spacesuits, but I had been learning about the history of the women who were responsible for sewing the Apollo spacesuits, who had, up until the actual anniversary of the moon landing, had been kind of written out of history. And now there's all these podcasts that came out in the 50th anniversary and people telling their stories, and there's been interviews. But I spent a lot of time looking into their work and why they didn't really have a more public face. And a lot of the project that I've been working on, Alterations, kind of thinks through that. But once the spacesuit had been kind of cemented into the text, it gave me a space to think about lineage, because my grandmother did alterations for a menswear company for her whole life. So this next poem is sort of thinking about her, imagining her as one of the spacesuit sewers, because these women were all just civilians who happened to have a skill, who worked in this particular area in the country, and so they just were helping out with us. And it's written as an epistle. How to Sew a Spacesuit, 1968. Dear blank, I've taken to pinning patterns on your bedroom floor where we dragged the sweating moon. Practical astronomy, our seam allowances smaller than a sewing needle's eye. Above us, the ceiling strewn with flowers cut from the leftover wallpaper of another room. If you can't dampen your grief, what will keep your fingers from being lured under the needle in sleep, from the bared teeth of the feed dog, gathering up fabric in the wake of our hands? Remember, 1 stitch fired per footfall means fewer discarded suits. If you can't forgive your scissors, chalk this constellation overhead, the long arm of the machine where we turn and turn again the whole body of your future daughter's spacesuit. About heirlooms, you know what they say. We will have to split one needle this winter, one end for me, one end for air, How we make do and mend is not always fair. And I should say, inside all these poems are these little plus signs where I have the epigraphs and other people's language. There was a quote from Max Ritvo in there. And it's all about this idea of this kind of stitching in of other people's language and this tradition of poetics, and also the way that we get to build this commonplace for ourselves. So all of the acknowledgements of that shared language is in the back of the book. So there is this sense that the way we carry other people's language is also part of that lineage, that I think of poetry as this thing we're heirlooming to each other. And that gave me a space in the midst of all this kind of loss of a sense of self to think through things. This next poem is called Debridement, but I had never come across that word when I first read it and kept thinking it was debridement, and was really thinking about the oddity of that crossover. Debridement. When I find out I'm pregnant, I bury my wedding dress in the front yard, letting everyone in the neighborhood watch me peel the blue satin over my head, my slipless figure, and a shovel. The school bus slowing its yellow dredge to witness the anxiety of the uncovered. I dig a tunnel to my grandmother, straight through my mother, her old flower bulbs, empty rattles, their bodies now fists in earth. I lick my ungloved hands and gather fragments of bone and leftover teeth into my mouth. How else to feed the matryoshka body, its double hummingbird hearts? Ashes, ashes. In the tunnel, I uncover a nightgown I sloughed off as I lost my virginity to a song about 11s, crawl back into its florals and incorporeal sense of expectation. The assistant's glittering self sawed open to applause. Down here, my new cluster of cells can't echo or mirror. It lullabies me with replication, tells me to revisit the rooms I flooded just to peel off the wallpaper, to uproot the ugly azaleas from the family before and before. When I arrive at my childhood, I undress the house like a wound. I'm gonna read the title poem, which is called A Real Spacesuit is a Little Envelope of Earth Conditions. And it's a quote by historian Douglas Lantry, who was describing a spacesuit as that. And the piece is kind of weaving other people's language in and out. And also it's very much like an exploded pantoum. And it's really what I ended up carrying over into the project I'm working on now, which I might describe as an essay in the form of a pantoum. So it's written in these really small sections that are recursive and move back and forth through each other. Oh, and it's also in conversation with this short story that Ilya Kaminsky wrote called Little Pot. When our mothers were astronauts, we sewed spacesuits from donated wedding dresses so we could buy better thread. We sewed day into night for the moonwalkers, gathering bolts of constellation in our arms. After every performance, we waited behind stage, taking measurements, giving compliments. They loved us. It was spring, we were sewing, the astronauts were singing, and inside our body, 2 babies were turning. They loved us so we sewed and sewed when we were the daughter for the astronauts. We waltzed on stage singing, in my moon suit and funeral veil, I am no source of honey, so why should they turn on me? Tomorrow I will be sweet. The bees were sowing air, we were bowing, gathering the meadow thrown around us. Inside us, twin moon faces reflecting in profile. If the astronauts were our daughters, if they were ours, they inherited their spacesuits from our abandoned trousseaus, gathering around them in meadows. They took in old seams, repaired our stitched réseaux, marking and measuring and singing backstage. There is a needle fair, though no appearance indicate 'tis threaded in the air. Inside each bridal chest, 2 envelopes waiting to be turned into wedding dresses. It was spring. There was applause. Then the astronauts left. Then our dead mothers left. The spacesuits were abandoned on the theater floor. The bees left. The singing left. Then we stayed. Didn't we? Didn't we let ourselves x-ray each other? Didn't we kneel down to listen inside the spacesuits? Didn't we pre-breathe? Inside a constellation in half, inside the envelopes, only one baby was teething. We stitched the empty envelope closed. We dug a hole in the stage and placed the body of our baby girl in the box from the sewing machine. We wanted a larger cemetery. We let the hospital's opera have the box. I did everything ourselves. I even managed to put on the moon suit somehow. I even managed to, yes, I sang, fetch the seam I missed closer, so I, at my sleeping, still surmise I stitch. I turned my face to the dark opera house. On stage, I was mewling. The astronauts were no longer returning, and inside my body, no babies were singing. You did not love me. It was spring. After the performance, I hid behind stage, mistaking sureness, grieving compliance. I had sung and sewed, night gathering the constellation that was left in my arms. She and I had missed our entrance, so I sewed isolette dresses from deconstructed spacesuits so I could bury the dead. As I unthreaded, we sang, but not the grief that nestled close as needles. We were so close. We bundled up the envelopes. I'm just gonna end on a piece that I've never read. It was written really late in the process. So much of this is thinking about grief and motherhood and my own mother and grandmother and place, but they aren't living, and there's something to be said about what it means to write your children into a poem. So this is the closest that I think I will ever get to that. We walked a lot in the cemetery in Salt Lake because it was just right above where we were living. It was a huge expansive space, and it felt like it was other people's dead, so it was a safe place for me to grieve. But we had a bit of an incident when we brought our child there who loved to go there. So that's what this poem is taking on. Eulogy. I carried one grief while courting another, because the moon pulled in a tide of early dirt, because I could not bury both my mother and a child, because the living child wanted to go to that place, Mama, with the beautiful stones where people leave flowers and presents. And now we are up each night with her sleepless fear of falling into those dark holes. Because the dirt was too, and my hands were, I'm throwing red thread over my shoulders, salting my grievances. Listen, in the woods we are banished from, the owls are giving back the bones of the ones, if they lived, we might have loved. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Cori, and thanks, Sarah. Thank you both for sharing your work. It was so powerful, such beautiful poems. And we're going to move on now to the conversation portion of the event. I'm really excited about that. Cori, you already shared a little bit of some background on your work and your process and stuff, so I'm really excited to hear you both talk a little bit more. So we're just going to let you all take it away. Take it away, Sarah and Cori.
Cori, it was amazing hearing those poems out loud. It's always just so special to sit with someone's work and, you know, hear it kind of in your own voice and then actually hear it in the writer's voice. Is it okay if I start by asking you a question? I have so many, and this could go on for hours of just me asking you questions. But kind of going off of what you were talking about as you read, I'm thinking about tethers and matrilineage as a line extending both, you know, into the past, but also into the future. And in your book, there's all these containers and made sort of conduits. There's envelopes and spacesuits, and there's sewing machines and fabric and ambulances and bees. You know, there's just all of these different empty things that are able to be filled or can be filled. And I would love to hear more about the containers that you kind of shaped or fashioned for grief, especially since I think grief can feel like such an interior, personal, private thing, but also like a really messy, unruly kind of explosion at the same time, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that's a great question. Also just really incredible to hear your work. I'm just excited about the idea of the ways we're moving towards shared space, even as we stay online right now. I think I really, I had written most of this book before I went go back to grad school, and that is not the book that came out. It was really about the loss of my mother. It was really unexpected, and I'm really close to my family and felt really like raised in this like really beautiful matriarchy. And then I had a really complicated second pregnancy and lost a twin. And so then was sort of reeling from this space. And I felt that I had been writing the loss of my mother, sort of very deeply metaphorically. Like I felt like it was like very entrenched in the kind of poetic tradition of the object as metaphor. And I suddenly really wanted to sort of have this sense that sometimes in the poems, the objects are metaphors and sometimes they're real. And to sort of move in and out of that sense of the container as that, so that the spacesuit is sometimes like a metaphor for some kind of containment, and sometimes that spacesuit is a real spacesuit. And that came out of learning about these women and their sewing, and suddenly kind of thinking about my own childhood through my grandmother and the work she just did offhand. And I think it gave me space to sometimes think about, strangely, like what I was putting on or taking off, that messiness. Like sometimes I could be in the container and be present with that grief as a connective thread between them. And sometimes it was like a place to just feel like there was a sense of safety, that like when I wrote that end line, I swear like no one will fit in this spacesuit but us, it was like somehow I could look suddenly at something that I couldn't before. So I think I needed this sense somehow that all of those containers were being heirloomed between poems, but that in each poem, as I approached it, it had a different resonance, that sometimes that was a real envelope and sometimes that was a conceptual envelope. And it really helped like finding the quote from that historian. That kind of felt like this like strange moment of finding that. But it felt like a way to approach that grief, which feels really like not bearable to kind of think through. Can I ask you a question back?
Oh yeah, of course.
So I've been thinking a lot in your work about how you talk about lasting and outlasting. There's this idea of the stories getting to carry forward well beyond us and well before us, and what that means for you inside of this matrilineal narrative that is really particular to how you view yourself as a daughter. So I've been thinking a lot about that line, I am but do not have a daughter, and what it means to kind of connect that space for you in terms of your identity after you became a mother yourself.
Oh, I love that question. Thank you. I'm also still thinking about what you were saying about containers being heirloomed poem to poem, and it feels connected in a way. So pretty much the entire book, except for one poem, was written before I had my daughter and before I was even pregnant. And towards the very end of the revision process is when I was pregnant and was in this like really weird space of revising a book that was sort of haunted by not having a child, and sort of thinking hypothetically, what would it be like to someday have a child? And it just cast the whole project in such a different light, and sort of made the book feel haunted in a weird, timeless way. The last poem to make it into the book was matrilineage umbilicus. And so I think the voice is a little different there, where I didn't really know what to make of my body as this new container. And the only way to kind of approach that was to write a contrapuntal with multiple voices, multiple women, and a lot of ambivalence kind of built into the structure of it. I'm also thinking, for me, the word outlast brings to mind outliving. And I feel like there's a lot that isn't said in the book about sort of the pain of lineage and the grief that you carry forward and intergenerational trauma, specifically around the partition of India and Pakistan. And so my grandparents lived through that when the countries they stopped being a British colony and became two separate countries. And it was a really horrific, violent sort of splintering, and the migration was very ugly. It was there was a lot of death and a lot of loss. And both sides of my family kind of shifted from India to Pakistan around that time, but neither side of the family talks about it. My one living grandfather, he doesn't talk about it. My parents don't talk about it, but I know that silence kind of colors everything in my life as well. And so it feels like, you've outlived this sort of colonial project. You've outlived and outlasted a particular kind of governance, and then also you survived in a way. But then even if you survive, like my father's father, I know from the few little splinters of information that I've gotten, was a really angry man. And my dad doesn't like to talk about him, but my dad is also an angry man. And I wonder how much of that has to do with the way he had to leave his home, my grandfather, and he had to leave everything that he knew. And then his family just kind of married him off, hoping that that would heal the wound and make him feel better and he would have something to distract himself with. But that trauma lingers, and then it's, intergenerational trauma. I feel like it's present in my life now too, but it's something that it's just a big hole that I'm just sort of feeling the contours of. And so I'm always thinking about, even if I'm outliving something, even if I'm one of, from a lineage of survivors of this really violent and tragic migration, what am I holding in my body and what can I pass down in my future lineage? And all of that is like a long, convoluted way to say, I think there's a lot that I felt I couldn't touch in the book and couldn't really tap into, because I think I have to wait for some people to pass in order to begin to do that work without any fear. And so, but I'm also haunted by the thought that like I could die before I get to do that work. I don't know. I'm just thinking about death all the time and what it means to outrun something, what it means to outlast a legacy of violence, and how much you're even capable of actually outlasting it. I wonder if we really can.
Yeah, it's so interesting thinking about this, like surviving. Like I actually have been was like looking up this morning about like chronophobia, like this fear that time is passing and that you won't like have resolved things. And I think because I lost my own mother so young and she lost her mother relatively young, I'm constantly obsessed with that narrative of like, what if I don't see my children? Like, what if the last thing I said to them this morning is the last thing I say? And like other people don't live that way, but I am uncovering my own family's long history very, very slowly, in part because of the kind of backstory, like not knowing that my family was Jewish until like very recently. Even though that's how I'm raising my own children, because my partner is Jewish. And I think there's this sense of like, what is our responsibility with our grief, that your book seems in a way kind of like I think there's something really beautiful about the fact that you've written through this before you had your daughter, that like you're trying to understand not just what is the conversation of grief you're entering, but really clearly what conversation of grief will they be entering into in this world? And that makes me really excited to think about your future projects too, like what we heirloom between collections when we're working on them. And that I was really, one of my questions for you is I watched an interview where you talked about how you'd written 98% of this book before becoming a mother. And I was so curious how you dealt with ordering the collection or thinking about the kind of patterning that you were coming up with, because so much of the collection is about this like what ifness, that then you actually became a parent. And if that did that shift how you were organizing how people would read the narrative inside the collection itself?
I think because I struggle so much with saying anything with any certainty, I feel like there was so much ambivalence built into the structure of the book to begin with, where I remember in workshops and whenever I would exchange poems with people, they would ask me like, oh, are you pregnant right now? Or did something happen? Or, you know, like I think people, so much of the specter of motherhood is in it that I think I kind of, I don't know, I joke with my partner that I like wrote myself into being pregnant somehow or manifested it in a way. It feels like fate that I had a daughter too, after writing about not having a daughter and wanting a daughter and being scared to have a daughter. But I feel like it kind of felt, once I had those last one or two poems that emerged in late revisions, that they did sort of fit in kind of seamlessly. But I did worry that the tone of them was completely different, where there was like, they felt more grim in a way, or at least a little bit more confused. But structuring for me, because I'm working with these matriarchs and I use a lot of persona and a few self-portraits, I think for me, the biggest thing I had to think about was just, how do I keep repeating myself without overwhelming the reader, or without what I'm so obsessed with becoming monotonous for them? So I was really stuck on how often I was repeating myself and trying to figure out what to do with that repetition, how to keep that repetition fresh and interesting and not overwhelming or boring. And that's something that I want to ask you as well, about repetition in your work. You said something while you were reading about grief being recursive. I'm wondering about the relationship for you between maybe repetition and form. I'm curious how form emerges in your work and how it relates to the body. Because you have, you know, these how-to poems, you have portraits and landscapes and all this intertextuality. And I love what you were saying about this exploded pantoum form. And yeah, I'm just wondering how form and repetition are kind of working hand in hand for you.
So funny, because that's like the next question I have for you.
Amazing.
Perfect thing to think about. You know, I think for me, writing the title poem in that kind of exploded pantoum felt like a permission. Like I just was like, I was so obsessed with this set of images and this idea of how they were heirloom between pieces, but I also didn't want it to be like just an interiority. Like so much of what grief is for me is this like is lyric time. It's like I'm in the woods on a hike or something, and also suddenly I'm like back in the hospital with my mom, and it's like for me this experience that I couldn't quite figure out how to get at. And I did it really through the, like what makes poetry so interesting to me is the collapsing of self and speaker, where like I don't think of my work as memoir-esque in a weird way. Like it's so deeply personal, but I think there's like my speakers have all this permission to do things that I can't do. And I felt like that was what the form allowed me to do. Like in some weird way, it felt like everybody in real time is so tired of your grief. Like it's like they want you to be done with it, because it's really uncomfortable to like for someone to sort of be in this place, you know, like, oh, like you're still not over this yet. And so that idea of repetition in the poems felt like a freedom to just keep like going back to it and being like, no, actually, it turns out I am still here. And the pantoum was so exciting for me for that, because it felt like I could have this slight variation that made me feel like I was moving forward, that like I always felt that I was moving forward inside those repetitions of grief, but it was clear to me that other people didn't. And when you're putting this work out in workshop, there is this sense of like, like Winrock with another grief, like spacesuit poem, another grief poem, where you're just like, I think the publicness of writing this book in grad school is really, really different than the sense of like the book that I'm working on right now, which is like, I've just been writing, I like finished my PhD and then got my first job, and I took a new job at Western after that. So I've been really kind of like writing that by myself, and it's been interesting. But I think for me, the form and repetition was a space to just like get to be obsessed and be okay with that.
I love that. I love that. I think that was a big thing for me too, where, I was so obsessed with Sarah, the matriarch, and what I could learn about womanhood, capital W, or motherhood, capital M, from, like the original mother, or from Eve, or from Mary, who has like the immaculate conception. Like, what does that word immaculate mean? And I only have one pantoum because I think pantoums are so hard. So hats off to you. They're so hard, but for me, it was so useful as like this container for repetition, because it's like one step forward and one step back at the same time, and you're just sort of like cycling through. And the poem that I have is about Sarah's inability to have children until she's so old, until she's in her, I think she's 90 or 100. And so just the menstrual cycle as a repetition that's just happening and happening and happening, and blood is just this recursive thing that just keeps coming. And so the pantoum was just perfect for that, where I think a lot of grad school for me was giving myself permission to just be obsessed with one thing and not second guess it. But I still worry. I'm like, oh God, is there too much Sarah in this book? I'm also wondering, you have so much, clinical language and language about space, and there's so much science, but then there's also so much, like, this is a really lyrical book, and there's so much music and singing. And when you were reading, you read the lines, "Inside my body, no babies were singing. As I am threaded, we sang." And I'm really wondering about, grief feels like this sort of wordless, huge void of just emotion. And then mourning is sort of this performance of that. How did scientific language come into play for you? Is it sort of a way to externalize it? Or I'm wondering about like the clinical versus the creative, I suppose.
Yeah, it's so interesting. Like there's twofold. Like I was doing, sorry, medical humanities. Like I as an undergrad, I studied creative writing and neuropsych, and I really thought I was going to go into science. In my opening day of like Neuro 101, my professor read a Dickinson poem, and suddenly I was like, oh, wait, like poets are in conversation with this like brain body space, and a lot of that clinical language that's in this book is what the book I was writing before I went back to grad school and the like space stuff came in. So I feel like in workshop spaces, people are like, you're too distant from this work. Like I felt like so much of my work in really diving into this is getting to the point where the grief is singing, where it's like that sense of like this chorus that's behind you, like even like a literal Greek chorus that's like supporting that grief and allowing you to be out there. Whereas it's so much easier, I think, in my brain to stay within the clinical space of that, of the science, like what it means, to be like, my family was really mad when my mother was dying, and I was like, her brain is not there, like she's not there, like this is this space, and they were like, she could be here, she could be listening. And I was really angry because I like needed the science to be okay with it. But then later I realized that was because I had this sort of gap in like a ritual or a spiritual sense to deal with that space. So I just kept relying on like what I had as this background, and I had to move through that. Which is really a question I have for you, is like, you know, I have this kind of jealousy of this sort of questioning and existence within faith in your book, that you have this collapsing of Sarah and these like the speakers of your poems. How does it feel to really to be working through that space of faith and these conversations around faith in a society where that's not really welcome, I guess? Like, it's not an easy topic. I mean, it's not easy to talk about motherhood. It's not easy to talk about womanhood, like so many things about the, the patriarchy and workshop spaces and what it means, like, to think through that, but to pair that with this other topic within your piece, like, what is it like to give yourself permission, and in a way like absolution? You know, you say, you have this line about absolution, and I break my bones, that your speakers have permission to really just talk about these things openly.
I'll say it's very scary. I come from my mother's side of the family is very religious, and my dad's side of the family isn't. And so I know a bunch of my family members ordered the book, and I'm really scared that they'll actually read it and give me their thoughts. But I've always been anxious about this, and also really sad, because the books that I was reading when I was younger, I was so hungry to find other Muslim writers writing about faith. And when I did come and encounter other Muslim poets or Muslim writers overall, I feel like people were writing from a really polemical place, and a place of a lot of hurt, which is definitely a true experience and true for me as well. But I was just so hungry for the reverence and for wonder and bewilderment, because it took me so long to reach a place of sort of existing in a state of bewilderment, and I wanted to know that others were there too, and I wanted to make space for that and hold space for that. And I feel like people think that if you're a person of faith, you're just less intelligent somehow, or, you know, too woo-woo or too out there to really think about the tactile, but I don't think that that's true. And in grad school, because my book was also written largely in grad school, I was really worried. I remember at my thesis defense that I was thinking about my audience of other Muslim readers and thinking that, what if they read this and they think that I'm like blaspheming, or, you know, just being too liberal with how I approach these, you know, capital S sacred figures. And one of my thesis committee members, Dara Wire, told me that asking questions is an act of love. And if you can't ask questions to the people you love, then what sort of love is that? And that gave me a lot of permission, because I think that I am very much, you know, not writing from a place of polemics. And I return to the image of Mary or Maryam in the Bible all the time, where, I'm sorry, not in the Bible, in the Quran, where when she's giving birth, she's sort of leaning up against this date palm tree and crying out in absolute agony, saying, "Oh, I wish that I had died before this. I wish that I was just, you know, gone in oblivion and forgotten." And I think that's so bewilderingly insane that, you know, somehow like an angel came to you and spoke to you and said, "You're gonna have a child, you're gonna have a child who's a really big deal, you're gonna give birth to Jesus." And it's a miracle, and that's your duty. And to know God in that way, and actually know concretely that he exists, but then still succumb to your body's pain and still feel your human emotions and say, "I wish I was dead." I think that's so astonishing, but also so freeing, because even if you've been touched by the divine in some way, you're still a woman, you're still a person, and you're still feeling those, the pains of labor, and it's okay to feel that. And so I think I extended that to questioning and to exploring these women as sort of containers for my own thinking. Because if they, knowing God, can still freak out and have a moment of being human and flawed and in pain, why can't I, as someone who's sort of believing sight unseen, just try to figure out what I believe, I also think what helped was realizing that I'm not trying to write over any women or writing against anyone, but really just thinking I'm collaging them from across scripture and using persona as a way to figure out what I'm thinking as Sarah, the woman, and Sarah, the poet in 2024. I'm not actually saying anything true or real about who the original Sarah was or who the original Mary was. All I can do is see in them, in the them that I conjure on the page, what my own biases are and my own curiosities are. So everything is through my own flawed body and mind, and I'm nowhere close to who they might have actually been. And I think realizing that also gave me a lot of permission that I'm not encroaching or trying to, what's the word? What's that? I'm losing the word that I need, but like stepping into someone else and trying them on and saying something declarative. Yeah.
I think it's so great to think about when you say like asking questions is a form of love, because then thinking about the way you write these speakers and that collapsing of yourself into them, it's sort of like this collection in which you gave yourself so much permission to ask yourself questions and to show yourself that love, which feels like just like a beautiful way of entering into a dialogue about your own place and time, I guess. Like I still think it's very unfashionable to write motherhood in a deep way. I was really excited to be asked to be on this panel, and also sort of like, where do I fit into this dialogue? Like, I don't immediately think of myself as a poet who's writing about motherhood, and I think that's so interesting to hear you reflecting on these people and these books and these very old stories, and being able to just see yourself in them even before you were in that position yourself is really cool to see that conversation.
Thank you. Yeah, no, I'm so excited that we're also kind of in the shared lineage now of the Alice James Editor's Choice, which is so special. I'm also, yeah, no, I think with your work, I feel like it almost feels like the book is then a quilt somehow, or a collage, like I was talking about before, where a quilt doesn't have to be uniform, and there's so many different patches that are all stitched together really beautifully, and they all cohere and they form this chorus like you were talking about. And I wanted to ask you about the plus signs that you use throughout, and you touched on this a little bit, but I think I was reading them as stitches and as a way to make things cohere, especially with intertextuality. And it has a new color for me hearing you talk about your grandmother who did, I think you said alterations. Yeah, I would just, please tell me more about the really cool plus signs.
So they really came out of like being deep in Emily Dickinson. She uses these plus signs for her variants, like when she has a word to the side that she's replacing, or she wants us to be like, well, I might have done this. Sometimes it's whole stanzas, sometimes a whole poem is like used through this plus sign. And I was really seeing them as this way of stitching things in other people's voices. I studied with Alice Fulton and Lyra Van Cleef Stefanen, who are both also thinking through, Alice is thinking through the bride sign, and Lyra is using these kind of long dashes and colons, and it felt like this lineage, like what do I care about punctuation here, and how do I make that happen? And then they looked like these little stitches, but they also look like the side of ambulances to me. And so it became this kind of space of connectivity. And also this didn't really end up in this collection, but this idea of the variant, like what is the alternate version of this that, you know, Dickinson's whole idea is you can choose not to choose. Like she never says, and this is the final version. We only have these sort of variations that she offered. And the collection that I've been working on, this essay, that's why it's written in the form of a kind of pantoum where every section of the essay really could replace another one or is undoing another one. So those plus signs started to kind of come in as this idea of that kind of quilted lineage, like where are we pulling from in other people's voices and how do we create that connectivity? Because I wasn't, like I hadn't really thought of my grandmother's work in that, and this alteration of things that already existed. And I really like that too, that like the stitching isn't something new. It's like adding together things that already are there.
Oh, that's beautiful. I'm really excited for your new book. I cannot wait. This was so wonderful. Thank you for having us get lit.
A big invitation. Also, like I'm really excited about the Alice Jamesness and like just listening to all the language even and images that cross over. It just feels like such an exciting space to be joined together in that.
Absolutely. But yeah, thank you, Get Lit, for hosting.
Thank you.
Wonderful. Yeah. Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Cori. That was so great. That was really wonderful. We are definitely so grateful to have you both as festival authors this year. So of course, thank you. And thanks to Alice James and to Lacey for putting us all together. I think this is going to be really powerful and inspiring to our audiences at home. So thank you again for sharing your work, sharing your stories, and for asking each other such thoughtful questions. It was really great. I'd also like to thank Liz, assistant coordinator of the festival, and all of our student interns for their help putting the festival together this year. For everyone at home who would like to learn more about these two writers, you can visit our website, getlitfestival.org. Remember that these virtual events are all free to access on our YouTube channel, along with dozens of events from previous festivals as well. And if you'd like to join us next year in 2025, which will again include both in-person and virtual events, please consider sending us a submission from May 1st through September 1st at getlit.submittable.com. Thank you again for joining us today, everybody. Goodbye.